We're live. Monster Podcast, episode number 6. I was reading through the analytics today as we're live on YouTube, and I realized that each episode has gotten over 1,000 downloads. I'm at 5,253 in just 5 episodes, which puts us as number 9 in the true crime podcast category for all of Apple Podcasts. And I see people, I'm looking at the countries here. People are checking in from New Zealand, Israel, Canada, obviously. Uh, they're checking in from South Africa, Mexico, New Zealand, Sweden. Listen today, Australia, and United Kingdom. So I just want to thank everybody so much. This is so much fun as I get ready for the book to come out and millions of cases to go over. And I'm just really proud and happy and having so much fun just chatting with you guys. So tonight's the premiere episode on YouTube. It took me weeks and weeks to get my YouTube channel up and running. I have no idea why. So if you're watching us right now, here we are. Terry Sutton of SavageWatch.com. Now let me just intro this a little bit. Back before I did anything with media, and I was just looking into a lot of true crime cases, I would often fall onto this local website, which looked like a guy who was local to me in Connecticut, who ran an incredible website dedicated to a lot of cold cases, unidentified pedophiles, serial killers. I would go to Reddit. I would follow him there. If you don't follow him on Reddit, you should. He would always bring up some interesting discussions, and the amount of detail that he would put in to writing up these little snippets on cold cases. I must have read the website for 2, 3, 4 years before I ever reached out to the guy. And then finally I reached out to him. We sort of connected, became friendly, and here we are. Terry, welcome in, my friend.
Well, Dave, it definitely is an honor. Congratulations on the successful podcast. Not only with true crime,
Thank you.
but obviously mixed martial arts, since I have covered a little bit of mixed martial arts for, a website or two or, some newspapers there. But
So you're in
yeah,
Connecticut. You started
yes,
the website in 2002, which is my God, it seems like the Stone Age. Now, what were you originally on? It probably would have been what, Angel Fire?
it was Angel Fire. Yep, there's still remnants of that Angel Fire page left. I had to change the server because it just was not reliable. But Angel Fire gave me a good run for a long time. I think the popularity it was actually most popular on Angel Fire before Google changed the algorithms. But
Sure.
we still get a lot of cases out there. There's a lot of true crime websites out there nowadays. I was
You,
doing it back when there weren't as many.
you were like the OG of true crime. I've been going to the website for years, even before I started getting into writing and when I was just working and interested when I was in school and now I'm back in school and that whole jazz. But, what the hell made you want to get on a computer in '02 and start a website dedicated to cold cases?
Well, this is a story I've told many people, including quite a bit of law enforcement as well, when they ask you about it or ask me about it. I remember seeing a website that was dedicated to having people write letters to Connecticut death row inmates, including Michael Ross, who was the last person executed on Connecticut death row before they abolished the death penalty. And I was kind of insulted by it. I'm like, what about their victims? Michael Ross had 8 homicide victims as well as 2 other sexual assault victims. There were other guys like, Daniel Webb, who, killed a woman, chased her down. There were several others that did horrible crimes. And I thought to myself, well, what about the victims? And at the time, I was kind of, looking into different websites. I thought about doing something about the paranormal. That's been an interest of mine. But there are already several paranormal websites. I said, well, why not do something regarding the victims' families? And I said, well, you're not going to get that much interest for crimes that have already been solved. But what about crimes that haven't been solved? And I remember thinking about the first case I really wanted to put on there, which was a case of an unidentified female teenager that was found behind a strip mall in New Britain, right off of Route 9, nearby a very popular mall called the West Farms Mall. And a couple years ago, they solved it, but for a long time, for about 2 decades, they had no idea who she was. A few years before it got solved, they realized that her DNA was tied, was some, well, her DNA was closely tied to a woman that was found around the same time in Massachusetts. And come to find out, it was a mother daughter, and it was the father slash husband that killed him so he could start a whole new family. So that case was the first one on the website. But what really started my interest in true crime was the Martha Moxley homicide. When I read about that as a kid in the Hartford Courant, hearing about a Kennedy cousin who at the time they were suspecting was Tommy Skakel, the older brother, who was last seen, kissing and making out with Martha. And we come to find out years later it was Michael Skakel, convicted now. Conviction has been, I guess, overturned. I don't know if there'll be another trial or not, but that's what kind of intrigued me. And I think before I started my website, there was a man that had a website up for Martha Moxley as well as Matthew Margulies, who was a young kid who would be my age. I think he would probably be about a year younger than me if he was still alive. His murder is still unsolved in the wealthy town of Greenwich, and that's a mystery. You know,
Sure.
but
Sure. Yeah, the Moxley case, just for people who do not from this area may not know, young woman killed by a man, allegedly killed by a man, a Kennedy cousin named Michael Skakel. Lots of discussion in this area for years and years about what actually happened. That's one of the most bizarre cases you can ever run across. And of course, he's the cousin of one of the most famous president, probably the most famous president in history. So outside of Donald Trump, anyway, now probably. So,
yeah, it
um,
was a wealthy family. It was a wealthy family. I think the police may have been intimidated.
sure,
Um, it's still a case that intrigues. I mean, there are still theories that say that Michael Skakel didn't do it. Um, I think the evidence that I believe he probably did do it, but I think the evidence to convict him was really hearsay. It was a lot of circumstantial, even though proximity wise, and there was motive. Um, but that's like a whole other episode. You can find
yeah,
people talking about that. But the
many
other person,
episodes. There's a
yeah,
picture of Michael Skakel there to the left,
actually, so
young
Michael
Skakel.
is that the brother? That's the Martha had a brother.
That's Yeah, I believe that's Martha's brother, John.
Martha's
Actually, I
brother, yeah.
apologize to my YouTube I failed you tonight, but you can just Google a picture of Michael Skakel. He's great. He's handsome. He's a Kennedy. So either
He's
way, and
very
you're right
funny.
about that. And you're right about that. But that's another 5 or 6 episodes probably. Real quick, while I got you, I mean, you're a Connecticut guy, we're talking Connecticut cases. It's been in the news in the past 10 years. Most specifically, the shooting at Newtown, Connecticut.
Yeah, it's kind of like the station nightclub fire where you did an article on, you did a podcast on that, where everybody knows somebody that was in that fire. I would guess to say, with the Newtown terrible shooting there of those school children and their teachers, I'd say the majority of people in Connecticut know somebody that knew somebody there. I didn't know anybody that was there, but I do know one of the bars I would go to, one of the bartenders there at her wedding. One of the girls killed in that was a flower child. I do know other people that said that you know that their child's godparent was the father of one of the kids there. So a couple people I had spoken to that said they knew some of the family members. I work as a title searcher, and boy, that's a face that scares the heck out of anybody. Um,
Yeah,
I do know that there was somebody there. There was an attorney that worked there who had lost her grandchild there. It just boggles the mind that people still think that the whole thing was like, some sort of crazy stage act. I just can't understand the hatred that a lot of people have to do that to the families. I believe that there's a lot about Adam Lanza that we're not being told about. I think that there were a lot of warning signs that we missed about Adam, that people missed about Adam Lanza, and that has not been brought out there. Early on in the investigation, there was chatter in the media that said that he was known to the police. You know,
sure,
we haven't heard any more about that. I think people
sure,
knew more about Adam Lanza than, or at least law enforcement may have known more about him than was let on.
sure,
Well,
sure. Yeah,
Newtown has had some strange stuff happen to it. I mean, the wood chipper murder, where the guy killed his, he was a pilot. He killed his wife and fed her to a fed her through a wood chipper, and they convicted him. Henry Lee, the famous
mhm,
forensic scientist who has a college named after him at the University of New Haven.
Hmm.
He helped solve that case there. There's at least another missing persons case there of another pilot's wife that went missing. I think there's also another case of a man whose live-in boyfriend, well, he disappeared. They believe that his live-in boyfriend killed him. I think those there were a couple cases in the 80s. And of course, there was also an infamous shootout, I think in the late 70s, early 80s, involving some motorcycle clubs. And all parties involved, I think two people died. One person was wounded on the one side, and the guy that did the shooting was executed, I think, on the road a year later. So it involved some one percenter motorcycle clubs, and that's still a mystery, as to who killed the guy that the bar owner where the shootout took place there. So Newtown's had some pretty unusual stuff, and it's a nice town. I've been there
Sure.
many times.
Sure. It's a, very affluent,
Yes.
rich neighborhood. Um, the case that probably drove me to your site, more than any, and really, you're the only one I've ever seen shed any light on this case. And we're gonna put some pictures up on the screen here. There's
Oh
one.
yeah.
There's another one, and there's the cachet. For the people who are not listening live, I'll link these pictures into the show notes if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. But let me just set the scene for you. West Hartford, Connecticut doctor who passed away in 1998, lung cancer. Um, a young man named Ken Mangini bought his house in 2005. In 2007, Mangini goes downstairs to remodel. I've actually gotten to talk to Ken on two separate occasions because I've looked into this case so much to see if I could connect him to some other serial predators from the Massachusetts area, New England area. This man was a doctor who Terry has been nice enough to connect me with the lead detective on the case, who I've been able to talk to a couple times. The man's name is Dr. George Reardon. They found the biggest cache in 2007 of child pornography that most of these detectives I've spoken with have ever seen. You're talking 50,000, 60,000 pictures, home movies, 8 millimeters. And also, a very little known fact that I was able to ascertain in my investigation is that Dr. Reardon, who lived in West Hartford, Connecticut, actually had a summer home in New York City, right up in upstate New York in the Hamptons. They raided that about a month later, after his death, and they actually found very much the same. So they already knew that Dr. Reardon
Mhm.
um, was into child pornography. They knew that he was a serial predator. He was a man who was his medical license was taken away, and he basically, he lived out the rest of his life in disgrace. So, um, how did you come to learn about this case? And again, I want to thank you for putting some light onto it, because this is a case that's been totally lost to history.
Well, I grew up in West Hartford, and I actually know people in high school that knew some of the kids that lived with Dr. Reardon, who you've been in contact with. And I'm sure you're going to, in your podcast, if it hasn't been done already, you'll probably do some more about that. So I grew up in
It
town,
hasn't been done yet, but trust me, it's coming. Go ahead.
and yeah, when I first heard about them, like, this is crazy, and the Hartford Current did a whole bunch of writing about, a whole bunch of articles about, Dr. Reardon, and we come to find out that one of the guys that wrote for, the Hartford Current was one of his victims. And I think in the early 70s, and his mother, who was of Irish ancestry, I guess a tough Irish woman, believed him. She asked, "What's wrong? What's going on there?" And she found out about it, got an attorney, and they tried to, I guess, either process had him have tried to either get him arrested or try to have his license removed. But I think the hospital did know that there was a complaint, and somehow it got lost, because when I think they finally got the next complaint there, they didn't take it as seriously until they got, I guess, by the third complaint, they finally decided to do something about him as far as taking away his license. Whereas if the first complaint had not been forgotten about there, they would have basically taken action a few years earlier. But this guy had victims in New York when he started, because I guess he grew up in New York. He was educated in New York and obviously moved down to Connecticut. He had a whole bunch of victims locally, got them from Hartford, West Hartford, his practice, obviously. He had victims that were both male and female. I think he had easier access to males where he could get them up at the cabin, but he did He did
Yes.
terrorize brothers and sisters. He did
One of the
terrorize girls.
rare offenders that usually, sorry, Terry, that usually there's a strike zone. They're interested in men. They're only interested in young boys or young girls, but he was an equal opportunity offender for sure. And just to
Mhm.
set one more scene, this was a guy who would send home letters. He would just send out mass mailers to families and say, if you have a child of this age, I want to conduct a growth study experiment on him. I mean, he was a well organized predator.
See, I had no idea about that.
Hmm.
That. I just learned something new today there.
Yeah, I
You
didn't know
know,
that either. That's not available in the public. Somebody tipped me to that they would literally get written letters. Someone from your neck of the woods who was about your age at the time, and had told me that Dr. Reardon would send home letters to families and say he would be conducting sex studies where he would need the children to be naked, or there's just so much there that needs to be told.
well, I don't think my parents would have gone for that, but I would have been scared if that letter had showed up at my house. There,
Right.
I can't really get into too much detail, but as I told you off camera one time before, we had other people in town that were doing stuff
Sure.
there. None to the level that Dr. Reardon did, but there was other stuff that had gone on in town. There were people who were either protected or when the truth came out, it was decades later, and you could not even. They were sued in court, but they were not prosecuted.
Sure.
But
He never did a
pedophiles
day in
have
jail for any of that ever.
never did a day in
Hmm.
jail.
Yep.
Pedophiles have a way of being. They're they're very intelligent. They're very dangerous. They're very conniving, and it's scary how many people have been victims of sexual abuse, girls and boys. But that's a whole other thing. That's a whole other story.
And the pictures that I just showed, the main point in your article there was that Reardon may have had some sort of accomplices. He might have had some people who were working in concert with him.
I had heard, and I know that you know this too, that he used to play golf with a retired priest, and that
Hmm.
there were
The
never
man's
times that
Cornelius Otero was his name. He came in from Brooklyn. He was a soon to be defrocked priest who was basically, they did to him what they did to priests in those days. He sexually abused a boy. They sent him away to another place to get better. Go ahead.
you know, I know that Otero in an article, I came across his name for the first time when I saw an article in the New York Post about a man that refused a lawsuit from, I think, the Catholic Diocese. And he mentioned Otero, and the New York Post did a great job. Whoever the writer was mentioned that Otero was working for St. Francis Hospital, same hospital where George Reardon is. So I'm somehow pretty sure that some of these pedophiles and child molesters, they always seem to find a way to connect with each other, which I'm sure you've
Sure.
either talked about or you will be
Mhm.
talking about in your episodes.
I've written
You
about extensively. Yeah, you're correct about that.
they
They
seem to
have a
find a
way of
way,
finding each other. Hmm.
and I can say
Sure.
that at least in my town, I think they found a way too, where I grew up.
It would be hard to believe that Otero and George Reardon would not have found each other. It's sort of a 1970s version of finding each other in chat rooms, and the internet didn't exist then, so you kind of coexisted with each other some another way. So, and yeah, like you said, without going into too much detail, there in the 1970s, everywhere in New England there was a problem with pedophilia, and I'm sure it was like that in your town as well.
Yes, yes, it was a problem, and I think it's still a problem in religious institutions, whether it's the Catholic Church, Jewish synagogue, mosques. We're finding that out there. Boy Scouts, high schools, junior high schools, they flock to where the kids are. They flock to the malls where they do all sorts of stuff there.
Yes. What
It's
could
scary.
just to transition, and I appreciate you shining some light on Reardon, and it gave me a lot of. I was just at the end of writing the Chapman book. I was sort of burnt out. I was looking through your site, and it sort of reinvigorated me. And who knows if I'll ever do a Reardon book, but there's so much more to come. I've got 4 episodes on Reardon, so for the people who are listening who have asked me about Reardon, and I've gotten a bunch of emails.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, there is much more George Reardon to come. Um,
I would love to
get,
see. I would love to see some of those guys identified. He,
yeah,
if they're putting those pictures out there, and obviously, I think Reardon had a certain type of paper or the print,
yes,
which you'll probably get into
yes.
in a future podcast. There, somehow I think those guys. I think Reardon. I'm getting the impression that maybe Reardon took pictures of what was
What
going on.
what it was, and I don't care about giving it away. No big deal. People, what happened was Reardon had his own home studio set up. This guy was like a genius with the old school way of sort of developing film, where you'd put it in that water, and long before,
Yep.
and he used a special parchment paper that was a quarter of an inch thick and made out of this certain material. The way he took the pictures, I mean, the detectives who worked on the case told me, if you showed me a George Reardon victim right now, I would be able to tell you that that's a Reardon. I could tell a Reardon from anyone else because of the way he took it, the lighting, as you can see in the pictures that we've showed, the sort of bright coloring in the back. Um,
Sure.
so, and I was talking to detectives who hadn't worked on the case since 2008. It's now 2021. It's 13 years later. Things have been, lost to time, but and we'll definitely get into it in future episodes. But George Reardon was great at developing film. He was almost an artist in the way he did it, and that was something that was just not seen then. A lot of the pictures were crude. Um, they were snapped, like 2 to 4 millimeter, whatever it was. So yeah, not to get too off, but yes, for
How
sure.
many victims do they think he had? What is like close to 1,000? There was a limit to it.
It's impossible to know. The man was never caught. The man never spent a day in jail. We talk about offenders like Wayne Chapman, who he
Never
admitted to
lost it.
100 victims. Yes,
Yep.
he admitted to 100 victims, but let's be honest, more than three-quarters of his life he was in prison, and
Yep.
he only had about 10 years, from about 16 to 26, before he got locked up forever. So only had about 10 years. George Reardon had 68 years
Yeah.
to
And
and much more
Seville, yeah.
resources.
I think his name was Jimmy Seville. He was a British TV personality. How many children did he
Yeah, there's another
raise?
one. You're right, Jimmy Seville. There's an episode I'm
Evil
working on
monsters.
now. Um, episode that I'm working on right now that you're going to enjoy, with a reporter from the Winnipeg Free Press, who's going to come on next week. A gentleman named Cram James, who was a hockey coach in the juniors up in Canada, and they estimate that he had around 1,500 victims of young kids, including NHL hockey player Theo Fleury, who's written about it in his book.
Sheldon Kennedy.
Um,
Sheldon Kennedy too. I
Sheldon
remember.
Kennedy.
Yeah.
Um, we're
I
gonna
wasn't
do
sure what
that
his name
one.
was, but I had no idea
Yeah,
he had that many victims. I knew Sheldon Kennedy when he first started talking about it. The guy went to jail, said there was a big NHL star,
yeah.
but he said he's not going to be coming out about that. But holy cow, 1,500 victims.
1,500 victims, and just so you know, he did. I believe his max time. I think he ended up with less than 36 months in jail. He's out right now and lives in Quebec. So that's just, for some reason, and we talk about it often when we connect, it's just these guys get protected, and I have been a
Yeah.
big advocate for the death penalty, because there's no way to stop them. They just have to be locked away from civilized society, or they just need to be killed.
Well,
I
unfortunately,
don't know how anyone to say it.
as you know, that they've basically abolished the death penalty, and now you've got all these people that are saying no more solitary confinement. We're seeing prison sentences lowered. And I know I'm getting off topic here, but
Go
when
ahead.
people start seeing that, we know that there's street justice out there. But that case in South Carolina there, where that mother and son were killed, that well from that wealthy family, where he's been
Yes.
alleged to, is it Murtaugh, I think there has been
Yeah.
alleged to have
Maritime.
been involved in I think maybe two deaths,
Yes.
accidental maybe, but we're going to learn more about that. But either that's somebody getting revenge or somebody being a vigilante. And down
Sure.
the road, I'm sure you'll do another podcast about vigilantes. They are out there. I know, at least on my website on the New Hampshire page, we have one possible vigilante case, which is bizarre and not for the squeamish, basically.
Sure.
But I think a true crime is not for the squeamish. But yeah, some people I just don't understand how they think. Some people just don't think like a human being.
Sure.
No
Give me some
rationale.
cases that are sort of your pet cases, one that bothers you over another. We all have those. I could rattle a couple of them off, but you've written so much about all these cold cases. Give me a couple that stand out in your mind.
I've been fortunate that quite a few of them have been solved.
Yep.
Elizabeth Hall's the one that, because I would go to that Subway restaurant where they found her back there. And ironically enough, years later, a serial killer who was completely unrelated, William Devon Howell, left 7 victims there. So the fact they were those the first 3 they were unidentified for several years. And I remember
Sure.
the daughter of one of a missing woman, and we were both talking. And I said, "You need to look at this particular guy," you know. And she was understanding. I said, "There's a possibility your mom could be one of these 3 victims." And it turned out she was the third victim that they'd found. And when they finally went back there and dug several years later, they found the other 4 victims. But those 2 killers who had nothing to do with each other, uh, that being solved, that was a big relief. The Bear Brook murders in New Hampshire, talk about bizarre. The one where they found the drum of a mother, and which they, at the times, they did not know if they were related, but it turned out to be a mother and daughter. And I think 10, 12 years later, I'm not exactly sure of the time frame. On another portion of the property, found another drum where they found 2 other girls there, and DNA would reveal that the woman was related to 2 of the kids, and the third kid was unrelated. And they eventually tied it into a horrible serial killer by the name of Terry Rasmussen. Now, Rasmussen, they're saying he killed the women and 2 kids. He was, obviously, he was the boyfriend of of that woman, and it was a genealogist. I think it was a
Yep.
librarian from Connecticut that solved that.
Yep.
But the third child was his own daughter.
Yes.
So they don't know
I
what
believe it
religion.
was the you had Marlise Honeychurch, who was 24, Marie Vaughn 7, and the 2 and 11 month year old child, respectively.
That's
So
sad to do that to a kid. Sometimes true crime, yeah, it it's hard sometimes. It's hard to really sometimes read the stuff there, see the pictures. Sometimes you go through burnout for a couple of days here. But who's the mother of Rasmussen's daughter? That's a mystery. There's also another missing woman that he was seen with, where he kidnapped the daughter and dropped her off in California,
yeah,
and she got reunited with her biological grandfather. So she's still missing.
there was a young
Rasmussen's mother.
woman, Laureen Ron. She disappeared in Manchester, New Hampshire, in 1980. Rasmussen lived couple mere blocks away from. He was a very good suspect in that case. Unfortunately, he ended up dying. So um, they
We'll
could never
never
tie
know.
it to him. Yep.
Yeah, and he took the secrets with him. There's a possibility we may find out there. I'm glad at least he got to spend his last few years of life in jail for at least one of his murders. It's just too bad he never got full justice. But then again, what is full justice? I don't know. We'll ever get full justice.
Right.
Uh,
And it looks like the murders were the genealogy you were talking about is called GEDmatch.
okay.
I'm a big believer in genealogy and uploading your DNA. We were just having this discussion this morning. We were talking earlier. There's been many cases lately that have been solved by DNA and building family trees, most notably the Golden State Killer.
Yeah,
Um,
that was beautiful.
yeah,
That's another case that I was pretty happy about there. So I guess we have to I guess as far as the unsolved cases, the cases that are still unsolved, all the killings in Vernon and Tolland, where all these girls went missing, whether it was Janice Pocket, Lisa White, though Mike
yeah,
Bouchard, who is a true crime author and a Bridgeport police officer, we both agree, and Michael first came upon it, that the relative of Susan LaRosa, who was found, went missing in 75 and, was found murdered in 78. She was a mother of 3, uh, as well as Irene LaRosa, who was finally reported missing a couple years ago, who there's a connection between the two besides sharing the last name, is that one is the sister and one is the husband of what Michael Bouchard believes to be the prime suspect, who probably could be responsible for not only those 2 homicides, but and disappearing. Well, we'll assume they're homicides. Others as well. There's also a guy in Granby, Connecticut that they've never identified. He's
sure.
probably been about 45 years ago. I would tend to think there's a possibility that could be the people responsible could have either been drug dealers in Litchfield County or the Springfield Mafia, who were pretty big back then. They were pretty feared. They had a lot more influence before the federal racketeering basically took down their numbers. As far as other states go,
It's just really kind of jarring to go over your Connecticut page and look at the
well,
amount of missing girls from
that was the
Connecticut.
first one I did, and then I branched off to Rhode Island. in
Hmm.
Massachusetts, New York State. Obviously, Long Island serial killer is a big one. That's one that intrigues a lot of people.
Yeah.
Um, I remember there was one in Maine where I had a, it was a suicide that I tried posting about, and they eventually solved that through just some
Sure.
good police work. There was the Grateful Dead fan that read it.
Yep.
People on Reddit. The mother of the deceased saw that he died in a car accident, and 20 years later, or close to 20 years later, she's like, "Geez, that looks like my son." And I think sometimes some people are afraid to know. They're afraid to really pursue it because they hope that their loved one comes back, not realizing that they could have met with foul play or an unfortunate circumstance. So there's been a lot. Quite a few of these cases have been solved, which is good, but there's still a lot. There's so many out there that just are not solved. I've talked to law enforcement in different states there, and a lot of situations where they know they have a good idea who did it, but they're just one step away,
Hmm.
or the district attorney or state's attorney doesn't want to prosecute. I
Sure.
think Rhode Island has had at least maybe one or two serial killers that they've never caught or they've never identified. Doesn't mean they weren't
Mhm.
caught. They may have been caught for one homicide, but they haven't
Sure.
been able to get them for other homicides. I mean, you look at Newport. There were some women that were killed in Newport, southern part of Rhode Island, obviously the northern part of Rhode Island. I know Rhode Island's a small state there, but yeah, there was quite a few white and Hispanic females that were, killed that could be tied into one or two different people. But
Sure.
yeah,
There's the case of the New Bedford Highway Killer here in the 1980s,
that's
who
another one.
there was a
Yeah.
lot of books written about it. I have my own theories on who did it. Um, I
Do
think
you
who did
think
it. Go ahead.
Do you think that it's the person that you think you did? I mean, if I don't know if you'll say that for a podcast or not, or is he currently serving time for
Nope.
one homicide? No.
He's currently the man who I well, just I'll paint the picture very quickly. There's a woman named Maureen Boyle who's a true crime author here based in
Okay.
Massachusetts. She wrote a book on Donald Eugene Webb, who is still on the FBI's
I
most
remember that
wanted
name. Yes.
list. Yep. He killed a police chief in Pennsylvania, but originally from Massachusetts. She wrote a book about the New Bedford highway killings, where, to be honest with you, just for the people who are not from this area, not familiar with the case, I believe it was 11 prostitutes in the small area of New Bedford, Massachusetts, which sort of borders the Rhode Island,
Sure.
Massachusetts line. Actually, they found a lot of bodies in a lot of different cities. They just call it the New Bedford Highway Killer. They
Yeah.
actually found him pretty much in bodies all up and down the South Coast here in Massachusetts, where I sit right now. Um,
I think two are still missing, but they count those two as well as
right.
they
And
count
who
those two.
knows how many more. There's a man
Yeah. Yep.
who I've been tracking for years who lives in my town. He's out right now. He's in his late 70s. It'll be in episode number 8, I believe. This is a man who has offended across 6 decades, who has
Wow.
spent the 2/3 of his life in prison, but was out at the time. Who every time he got out of prison, he offended again. He's been he was committed to the Massachusetts Treatment Center for the Sexually Dangerous for 18 years. He got out in 2014 after being in since 1996. He also did a long bid from the 60s into the 70s and got out right around the time of the New Bedford highway killings began. And he absolutely um, was fixated on female prostitutes. And he never killed any. He was never convicted of killing any, I should say. But he was convicted many, many times of raping prostitutes. He raped 2 young girls in a state park in Fairhaven, Massachusetts in the 1960s when he was 17. He's had a life of raping and abusing and terrorizing women, and he's about 1.5
You said
miles from where I sit right now.
you said 1960s. Because
He's
there's an
very
unsolved
old. He's 84. Go ahead.
there's an unsolved homicide, I think, in Holyoke, that right near an
Sure.
old amusement park. I
Yeah.
think that happened in '68.
Yeah.
Yeah.
68. I know what you're talking about. I can't. That's such a bridge too far from where he operated. I don't see
Okay.
him being that mobile. I mean, as I sit right here, I live on the opposite end of the state, so I'm an hour and a half from Holyoke. I live
Okay.
closer to, like, I mean, I throw a stone, I'm in Providence. I'm on that side of the country, of the state. So,
Okay.
um, yeah, I mean, you'll see it soon. I'm certainly not going to slander the guy. I think it's a very crazy charge to throw at somebody. But
Sure.
I think if you look at the evidence and you look at the history, you look at the background, you sort of piece everything together geographically, and then look at the behavior, look at the victimology. It's
Was he seriously? Was he assaulting these? I mean, granted,
oh
sexual
yeah,
assault. Sexual
brutally
assault is
beating
a
them.
crime. Okay.
Yes,
Yeah. Okay.
brutally beating them, sodomizing them,
That's not.
and
That's not
the
just
he
half step. Yeah.
right. I mean, like we've talked about in the past. I mean, things get out of hand, and then all of a sudden, um, yeah.
The
I
cops
mean,
are
does that
involved.
happen 9 times or 11 times? I'm not too sure, but it's
Yeah.
deserving of a look. And I've talked to Maureen Boyle, the woman who wrote the definitive book on the New Bedford highway killings, and I suggest that you
Sure.
read it. She'll be on this podcast shortly. She had somebody else in mind who was a lawyer. She names it in the book. He was into drugs. He practiced law. Then, as soon as the killings got hot, he took off and moved to Florida. And
Or the attorney.
you know,
The
yeah,
attorney.
the
Yeah.
attorney. hmm
Um,
So,
well, the guy was mentioning that serving time in murder. That's Skesney. Do you think
yep,
he's the Main Street South Woodsman, the one that was taking all the prostitutes, the one that
yes,
the prostitutes from
yes,
Smithson? Yeah, I mean, yeah, he was a violent guy. He got very lucky that he didn't get charged for a couple of sexual assaults because I think the one died of a drug overdose, and the other one there was just untimely deaths that benefited him, and they finally got him for one homicide, I think in Fitchburg, Mass. But he
sure,
fit a lot of characteristics there. And of course, in Vermont and New Hampshire, they never caught the Connecticut Valley River killer.
yep,
This
yep,
guy was violent. I don't know if he sexually assaulted his victims, but this guy just hated. I mean,
yep,
pure hatred of women. I also kind of wonder if it's possible that Robert Durst, who had a
yep,
place up in Vermont, if he could have had been involved because they were looking at him for the disappearance of Lynn Scholze. Not to mention his wife, his best friend, and obviously they tried to convict him on killing his neighbor in Texas, and that didn't work. But
sure.
Durst was so maniacal. I mean, he wanted to kill his own family, his own brother. So
Yep.
you know,
No, Durst is a interesting character who sort of weaves his way into Massachusetts, sort of New England. A lot of these serial
yeah,
killers who sometimes don't even start out in the state. They're not born here. They're living in other parts of the country. I mean, Ted Bundy at one point was here in Massachusetts. People don't realize that.
I know that.
He's
I
a
know
guy
the
who was
Bill
born in
Bundy.
the Northwest. In research for my book, I was finding, guys with 6 decades worth of pedophilia offenses in the middle of the country in the Midwest. And then I start looking through their records and I see that in the 1970s, they were living in Massachusetts
There
randomly,
was a guy.
you know?
There was a guy that did some serial killings of I think boys in California, and he was in an orphanage in Connecticut where they think he was sexually assaulted. But I don't
Sure.
know, it's like a Phantom Freeway killer. I'm not really sure, but they caught him, and he was a bad one. I mean, these guys are so maniacal, but also I think some of these people are not necessarily born evil. I think a lot of them are, but some of them become evil. Like Warnos, the female serial killer. I don't
Yeah.
think she was born that way. She just had so much abuse and so much
Yeah.
bad stuff done to her. She
Yeah.
became a monster. So some of
She
the
hated
people,
men and she was a
yeah,
lesbian and or if you, people again who don't know the story of Eileen Morenos, I mean, she was I believe she was sold for a pitcher of beer by her mother when she was like 12 years old. Or there's a
her
great
father
movie
took her
called
in for, she was
Monster. I
just
believe Charlize Theron played her, did a great job.
yes, I think so.
Um,
Yeah,
and there's a great book, which again on this podcast I will always recommend that you read the book and not watch the movie. And the book is also called Monster. I suggest you read that. Um, so just wrapping up, Terry. I'm sorry, it's 38 minutes in. I don't want to take up too much of your time, man.
sure.
I appreciate it. What's the is it rewarding running this site? Is it a lot of work? If you look through this site and my true crime, my monster podcast fans, you guys got to go to savagewatch.com. It's just a one-stop shop for all things cold cases. It's not just New England. He touches on California. You're looking at federal. You're looking at, you
Florida,
know,
all over. Submit your cases. We'll put it on there. I have to admit, there are some other websites out there that came after me that have become very detailed. My website was always to kind of mostly a couple paragraphs. There are other websites out there that really dig into some serious details. There's some great websites out there. Uh, but I generally tend to feel very happy with the website when I have victims' families come to me and say, thank you for getting the case back out in the public eye.
Yeah,
That's very helpful. There's cases that I've been where people have contacted me where their missing loved ones are not on NamUs, where we've put that out
sure.
there, or we've helped get I think with the case of Lisa White, when her mother was still alive, we helped get her filed with the missing persons organization. And I remember Lisa's mother contacted me saying, when she finally saw her daughter's picture in the Walmart, the poster, she had this like, she wasn't sad, she wasn't happy, she said it was just a bizarre, but she was so, in the end, she was happy to see that there was some recognition for Lisa, and obviously there's been some more press about her, even though it's 1974 that she went missing from Vernon, Connecticut. But there's other people that say, gee, thank you for putting that out there, getting the information out there. Has it directly helped solve any cases? Um, I think it may have with the Elizabeth Hodge case, because we did mention that it was a mother and daughter when they finally reported a missing persons case in New York State where they were last seen there. I'm pretty sure, at least I'm hoping that they went to my website, but the genetic DNA would have eventually solved that case
Solved it
anyway.
anyway.
Um, there's other cases where I think that the bad guys know that the families are still thinking about their loved ones. And yeah, I
Sure.
mean, I have a lot of cases submitted by family members and friends. So
We were just talking about one this morning that we're going to work on for,
we're gonna work
that's,
on that too.
you
The
know,
other thing I do with
and
Savage Watch too is that a little bit of paranormal, a little bit of weird stuff, because there's so many true crime websites out there. But I do a lot of stuff with scams too. I try to highlight that stuff there. In some cases, I've tried to help people out there, um, because that is becoming a big problem there. We've
sure,
talked about how pedophiles and rapists take away your innocence, your soul. Murderers take away your life. Um, Scammers take away your dignity and your life savings. Do I think they're as
sure.
bad as the others are? No, but they ruin lives too. People do take their own lives because of that. But I will still focus. The Savage Watch will still mainly be focused on cold cases and trying to help the families out. And Dave, you do a great job with the podcast. While we're on here, I want to tell people, please, if you're familiar with the station Nightclub Fire, please listen to that podcast. Excellent, excellent podcast. Uh, that's the case that being going to college in Rhode Island, I was always, after that happened, I was always paying attention to that. My brother knew somebody that survived that fire. I know somebody else who knew people that died in that fire, but there's a lot of stuff that needs to be, a lot of stuff people don't know about what
Don't
happened
know.
there. And obviously the jobs that you do regarding these pedophiles, and it's tough stuff to listen to, but it has to be told because they're out there, and parents and family members and friends need to know how these guys, and in some cases women, operate, or shall we just say monsters, because that's what the podcast is about. How these monsters operate. But Dave will
Thanks,
be
man.
doing something.
Mm.
We'll be doing something with a case that I brought up to him, and I think that we're going to get some interesting answers.
I
Stay
think
tuned.
that you're right about that. The most gratifying thing is you never think you're going to solve anything, but the most gratifying thing is when people contact you and say either thanks or hey, can you? Because there's many cases as we know about and all the famous stuff, that's out there. There's still so much, and I say this is my saying all the time. There's so much shit that doesn't have a Wikipedia page. It's stuff people don't know about. Um,
Yeah,
George Reardon is the worst child pornographer that anybody's ever seen. Um, Nobody knows who he is. He's not on Wikipedia. There's no Dateline. Nobody's talking about him, and that there's so much stuff just lost to history. You know,
yeah. I would love to see at least these people in the pictures, uh, if they're not alive, identified, so people can see that they were monsters. That they took advantage of children, that they ruined children's innocence. Some of his victims, his victims are now 60, 70, 80. Well, I would say they're 80 years old there, but that still impacts them. You could still get married, have kids, live a life there, and it still eats away at you. It's
can I
still,
tell you the worst part? And we'll close on this. Much
Sure.
like Chapman, I found with Reardon, a lot of his victims went on to abuse other kids and ruin their lives. So it just has a ripple effect, you know? So
It's sad.
I
It is
talked to
sad.
one of Chapman's victims who he's a pedophile and he destroyed other kids' lives, and it's the pedophile butterfly effect. You know, Wayne Chapman destroyed them, George Reardon destroyed them, and they go on to destroy other people. It just never ends, you know? So
And the keys to break
the
this
website,
cycle. Yeah. The
right,
keys to breaking
right.
the cycle. Though some people will never. To some people, it's just an attraction, but to other people, it's a learned behavior. It's an angry behavior. Those are the ones that you have to kind of try to prevent.
Some people are
Those are the ones
just
that can be prevented.
born that way. Those are
Yes.
the true monsters. Good place to
Yeah.
end it. The website's called savagewatch.com. His name's Terry Sutton. This I can't not recommend this website enough. I probably look at it 2 or 3 times a week, and this is nothing that I haven't said to Terry when nobody's listening and we're just talking together. So the guy really does a great service. I appreciate you hanging out with me, Terry. I really do, brother.
Okay, Dave. Thank you for the good job that you do.
Thank you.
And we'll be in contact.
Of course.